Kavanagh spent some time with Mr. Suidani and says his contribution to his community helped him navigate life as a politician.
Look, Daniel Suidani's background is really interesting. It's kind of not atypical in many ways of Pacific regional politicians. He was a member of his community. He started his career as a school teacher. He drifted eventually into construction management. But he was elected as part of a provincial election for the provincial assembly. You know, these are very small constituencies of only several hundred voters at a time. And he was elected back in 2019 on a margin of just 9 votes. So he was one of those individuals that was part of his community, a teacher, a business person, and decided to run for politics. And just by the smallest margins ended up making his way into his provincial assembly.
He became one of the most vocal critics of the country's diplomatic switch from Taiwan to Beijing in 2019. What did he tell you about his stance against China?
Well, my first interaction with Daniel Suidani was after he'd basically become famous globally within Solomon Islands for stating that when Solomon Islands switched allegiances from Taiwan to China, he basically said that he was given a bribe to support that switch. And he very unequivocally, very early on said, no, I'm not going to accept any interference because my views are that we should remain with Taiwan. And this is very early in his premiership. This is just several weeks really into him becoming Premier of Malaita. And that's where he really rose to prominence. So my first interactions with him were really interrogating his views. And he was genuine in those views. He genuinely thought that there was a big risk towards the switch from Taiwan to China. That's a very legitimate and widespread view across Solomon Islands, including in his province of Malaita. But what was very clear in those early weeks, in those early months, was that Daniel Suidani was using this China issue as a way to really elevate his position as a national politician as well. And I think he did have aspirations over time to become a much larger figure in national politics. And I think he viewed the Taiwan issue as a political opportunity for him, albeit one that he genuinely did believe in as well.
Well, his views on China placed him at the forefront of national debates. Just how controversial was he and how was he viewed by the people?
Well, the people in his constituency, the people of Malaita, did genuinely like him. He was very popular. Of course, like any politician, it wasn't universal. There were his opponents within Malaita and across the country. But there was a real concern within the people of Malaita that this relationship with China wasn't in their interests. There's a long-term, long-held dispute between the Malaitans and the rest of the country around, Malaitan interests not being looked after. And the China relationship was viewed by many as another example of an out-of-touch elite in Honiara, basically telling Malaita what to do. So there was genuine unrest and opposition towards the China relationship in Malaita, which he tapped into. Where his controversy really came from was that the national government, led by Manasseh Sogavare at the time, was obviously completely opposed to his views, and they sought to scapegoat him and certainly sought to center him as the primary opponent to their political mission. And in some ways that was quite successful.
Talking about that unrest that you mentioned, a Honiara court is ruling on whether unlawful assembly charges against Suidani related to 2021 anti-China protests in Malaita should be thrown out. What is the latest on that?
Well, look, that's been a very long-standing legal dispute. There were terrible riots, terrible unrest in Honiara in the end, November of 2021. It led to Australia sending in peacekeeping troops. So it was a real tragedy. Several people died. So certainly do not want to understate the significance of that event. Effectively, that event was led and organised by Malaitan nationalist groups that were aligned to Daniel Suidani. They were certainly supporters of Daniel Suidani. But it is unclear the degree to which the Premier himself at the time had any say or any influence over those riots. So I think there's been no successful, trial so far of any of the proponents or the individuals involved in those riots. Most of those cases have been dismissed, and I think it was likely, albeit a speculation, that that'd be a similar result with Daniel Suidani. So those court cases were unsettled, but I think it would be improbable if he ended up being, sent to jail or actually convicted of those charges.
Daniel Suidani was removed as Premier of Malaita in 2023. What brought about his downfall?
Well, the nature of Malaitan provincial politics is that it doesn't matter how many people support you in the community, there's still the reality of parliamentary numbers. And over time, his focus on the China issue over the bread and butter political issues of making sure the roads are paved, making sure the basics are getting done within the province. It seemed that seen by some of his opponents within the parliament that he was potentially distracted by this China issue. And there doesn't take many numbers within that parliament to shift allegiances to another individual, and therefore he lost his premiership. So there was speculation at the time that there was broader issues at play, China interfering, other countries interfering. The reality was this is local politics at play. This is provincial island politics in the Pacific. Daniel Suidani, unfortunately, fell over because of that reality. But nevertheless, he had a very outsized and influential time as premier, which is completely unusual when you think of the context of provincial island politics. There's not many individuals that we'd be talking about in this regard today who are in those sorts of positions in the Pacific.
And Ed, you were aware he was suffering an illness, but his death still comes as a shock.
He had been suffering certain medical conditions for a period of time. He actually spent, way back in 2021, I believe it was, a significant amount of time in Taiwan receiving medical treatment. And, at the time, there was speculation again that this was some sort of political ploy, that he was over there, meeting with Taiwanese politicians, etc. But really, he was genuinely ill. He had a condition in his brain. He had a brain lesion at the time. And though there hasn't been a lot of commentary or discussion or news about his health condition since, he did battle with genuine health conditions. So it was definitely a surprise to me and to many that he unfortunately and tragically passed away. But it was also, not entirely surprising in some ways, given his history of medical challenges.
And just finally, what legacy will Daniel Suidani leave behind?
Well, I think for those that saw him as, a lion against China, he's going to be sorely missed. He was elevated to a global status by those that saw China's influence in the Pacific as a threat, and his very passionate, opposition towards that was viewed with great effect by many around the world. I think internally in Solomon Islands, his reputation will be mixed. There'll be those that absolutely supported him, that were very loyal to him, that aspired for him to come back. But there are others that also, as I mentioned before, were sort of viewed him as distracted by these higher level issues rather than the bread and butter issues of local politics. So I think his legacy at home will be mixed, but there's certainly going to be many individuals that do remember him. And again, it is very rare that a provincial politician in the Solomon Islands or in the Pacific is noted internationally at all, let alone as, in these conversations around legacy.
Ed Kavanagh, really good to get your thoughts.